So Heewon, can you give us a brief summary of your podcast?
Yeah, so my podcast is sort of an exploration of global anti-corruption movements. So the first episode starts with the US and kind of looking at what is corruption. We talk about corruption a lot, but people, I think, use this term to refer to lots of things that they don't like bad governance or just even like political parties they don't agree with, right? So taking a deeper look of what is corruption, what's the history of corruption in the US, how does corruption differ in the US versus other countries? I think one thing that we talk about in the first episode is there's a perception, I think, often that certain countries are quote unquote more corrupt than other countries. But I think it's important to, if you understand it more and look into it more, it sort of becomes clear that it's more like there are different types of corruption that exist, and some types are more prevalent in certain countries. Other types are more prevalent in other types of places.
So what kind of case studies did you look at? You have 3 episodes. How do they unfold in a general sense?
Yeah, so the first episode looks at the U.S., like I said, and definitions, and uses Rod Blagojevich's. I don't know if you. So Rod Blagojevich was a former Illinois governor a few years ago, who, when Barack Obama got elected, he tried to sell Obama's Senate seat, which of course is not legal. So the U.S. was the first case study. Then the second episode moves on to Brazil. And looks at the Lava Jato scandal, which was this huge money laundering operation that was, the corruption was operating at extremely high levels, reaching the presidential office in Brazil and implicating every single political party in Brazil, essentially. And, I don't want to give too much away, but it was, it's huge construction companies, all of these private sector businesses were involved in essentially creating cartels and getting overpaid for government contracts and then sending kickbacks to their government crony people. And then the third episode looks at South Korea's impeachment of former President Park Geun-hye. She was embroiled in a political scandal a few years ago, which ultimately led to her impeachment and then her imprisonment as well. And I think a lot of people might know Park Geun-hye for being the first woman president elected in South Korea, for going to jail perhaps, but I think it's a much more complicated story than that. It's her whole family has this really complex legacy of her father was the first, he was a former dictator in South Korea, extremely brutal leader, but also known as the man who created modern South Korea, built the economy that it is today. So I think it's, it's a really interesting story with shamans and crazy types of things, cult leaders, things that kind of stranger than fiction, you could say. But I think both of these cases, the Lava Jato and Park Geun-hye's impeachment, are interesting because I think they're not really common knowledge in the U.S., but things that people in South Korea and Brazil, respectively, have really strong feelings on. And I think they were really important historical moments for both countries, national identities and paths.
So how did you come up with this idea? Was it you've been working in the democracy, conflict and governance program here at Carnegie? Did something come along that made you intrigued about this topic?
Yeah, so I was working on this project with my supervisor or senior fellow, Rachel Kleinfeld, and we were researching the effect of populism and declining democracies on the business community and looking at various case studies of this. And one of them happened to be Brazil. So I was spending a lot of time researching Lava Jato and learning about how this event had really changed and transformed Brazil's political landscape. And just learning more and more kind of made me realize, wow, this is such a complicated story and I kept talking about it to my friends, but often they don't want to hear me just rattle off. And I've always been interested in podcasts and radio as a form of storytelling. And I love that you can incorporate, it can be educational, informative, but also you can add music and, narrative arcs to make it into a more artistic experience.
That's terrific. And I have to say that it certainly comes through as a labor of love. And I also want to say how rare it is for anybody, much less somebody who's here, a junior fellow, somebody who just recently graduated from college, to actually be able to produce something like this. So anyway, Heewon, I want to thank you for taking the time to give our listeners a preview of Behind Closed Doors, Corruption in Democracies,